hegemony of sentient species possessed, in their infinite bureaucratic wisdom, a filing system so complex that it required 3 separate departments just to locate where they had misplaced their filing system documentation. This was, according to their official literature, a feature rather than a bug, a testament to their sophisticated approach to galactic governance. What it actually represented was 27,000 years of accumulated red tape, wrapped in purple tape, sealed with gold tape, and stamped with the authority of beings who had long forgotten why they were stamping things in the first place. At the heart of this magnificent monument to administrative excess lay the Department of Xenobiological Threat Assessment, an organization so paranoid that they maintained separate files for whether a species could pose a threat while awake, asleep, or in various states of partial consciousness. They had, over the millennia, catalogued every conceivable form of danger the galaxy might offer, from species that communicated through weaponized poetry to others whose reproductive cycles involved the strategic deployment of antimatter. The humans of Kepler 442c had recently achieved the dubious honor of receiving their own threat assessment file, though the bureaucrats responsible for creating it couldn't quite agree on what section it belonged in. Were they a Class 3 unpredictable variable species, given their tendency to solve problems by hitting them with progressively larger tools, or perhaps a Class 7 chaos engine, considering their apparent ability to accidentally stumble into galaxy-altering discoveries while looking for better ways to prepare their food? Veltar, senior coordinator of monitoring operations, had spent the better part of 3 standard cycles staring at the human assessment reports, which read like a collaboration between a xenoanthropologist and a particularly unhinged comedian. The humans had somehow managed to establish a thriving colony on a planet that every other species had written off as aggressively uninhabitable, using nothing more than what appeared to be concentrated stubbornness and an alarming willingness to eat things that would qualify as chemical weapons on most civilized worlds. They've built their primary shelter directly adjacent to a geological formation that produces random electromagnetic pulses, Veltar muttered to his assistant, a nervous Kiksthu named Nixara, who had the unfortunate tendency to interpret everything as a potential threat. And they're using it to power their communications array. Shouldn't those pulses interfere with their equipment? Nixara asked, her 4 eyes blinking in asynchronous patterns that indicated deep confusion mixed with mild terror. By all known laws of physics, yes. According to our readings, they've somehow convinced their technology to work better because of the interference. Veltar's tentacles twitched in the galactic equivalent of throwing his hands up in surrender. Their engineer claims it's because human-built equipment is naturally stubborn and performs better when it's angry. The hegemony's monitoring station, orbiting Kepler 4042c, had been established according to their standard first contact observation protocols, which dictated that any newly discovered species should be watched from a safe distance, while committees debated the appropriate level of interference. These protocols had been written by species who had never encountered anything quite like humans, who seemed to approach every challenge with the assumption that the universe was merely being unreasonably difficult rather than actively hostile. The concerning part, Veltar continued, reviewing the latest batch of surveillance reports, isn't their technological adaptability, it's their complete lack of awareness that they're being observed by 17 different species, 3 of whom are actively placing bets on how long they'll survive. The betting pool had become something of an embarrassment for the hegemony. What had started as a small wager between Kiksthu scientists had evolved into a galaxy-spanning gambling operation, with odds constantly fluctuating based on humanity's latest inexplicable survival achievements. The current favorites were betting on whether the humans would accidentally discover faster-than-light travel before or after they figured out how to make their replicators stop producing food that technically qualified as edible but tasted like existential disappointment. The first reports of something unusual in the human settlement area came from scanner technician Dekmore, whose species possessed the enviable ability to remain motionless for extended periods, while their sensory apparatus operated in 17 different spectrums simultaneously. This made them excellent surveillance specialists and terrible at parties, though nobody had ever been brave enough to mention the latter fact. Movement signatures detected in grid sector 77 Alma. Deckmore reported in his characteristic monotone that somehow managed to make impending doom sound like a weather forecast. Object appears to be avoiding standard detection methods with what I can only describe as supernatural competence. The problem with supernatural competence, as Veltar had learned through painful experience, was that it usually indicated either advanced technology being used by someone who didn't want to be found, or the universe's tendency to produce beings that operated according to their own private set of physical laws. Both options were typically followed by large quantities of paperwork and strongly worded memos from species who felt that reality should behave more predictably. "Can you get a visual confirmation?" Veltar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Negative. Whatever it is appears to be utilizing advanced stealth capabilities. Our sensors register movement, but the moment we attempt to focus on the source, it vanishes. Preliminary analysis suggests it may be phasing between dimensions, or possibly just very good at hiding behind trees." The distinction between interdimensional technology and excellent hiding skills had been a source of ongoing debate within the hegemony's scientific community. Many supposedly supernatural phenomena had been revealed to be the result of beings who were simply more creative about problem-solving than their observers. Others had turned out to be genuinely supernatural, which was significantly more paperwork for everyone involved. Who junior xenobiologist Zekval had been monitoring the situation with the sort of professional interest that generally preceded either major scientific breakthroughs or spectacular professional disasters. Her species possessed an unfortunate combination of insatiable curiosity and absolutely no sense of self-preservation, which made them excellent researchers and explained why their life insurance premiums were calculated by the hour rather than the year. "I've been analyzing the movement patterns," Zekval announced during the daily briefing, her excitement causing her to vibrate at frequencies that made nearby equipment develop concerning rattles. "Whatever this entity is, it's displaying behavior consistent with apex predator hunting patterns, but with one significant anomaly." "Which is?" Veltar asked. Though he had learned to approach Kixthu revelations with the same caution most species reserved for unstable explosives. "It's not hunting the humans. If anything, it appears to be avoiding them while maintaining a protective perimeter around their settlement. The behavioral pattern suggests a guardian rather than a predator, which makes absolutely no sense, according to any known xenobiological framework. The concept of a protective apex predator created the sort of logical paradox that hegemony scientists approached with equal parts fascination and terror. Their classification systems had been designed by beings who believed the universe operated according to reasonable principles, not whatever fever dream of evolutionary biology was apparently unfolding on Kepler 442c. "Perhaps it's territorial," suggested Nixara, whose contributions to scientific discussion typically reflected her species' tendency to assume everything was trying to kill them until proven otherwise. "Maybe the humans have inadvertently established their settlement within its hunting grounds. That would explain the protective behavior," Zekval agreed, "but not the stealth capabilities. Territorial predators typically rely on intimidation rather than invisibility. This entity seems to be going out of its way to avoid detection while maintaining surveillance of the human colony." The surveillance reports had begun to read like ghost stories, full of fleeting shadows and equipment malfunctions that happened just often enough to be concerning, but not quite frequently enough to be definitively attributed to external interference. Motion sensors would trigger at the edges of the human settlement, but visual confirmation would reveal nothing but empty terrain and the occasional confused local wildlife. "It's like it knows exactly how our equipment works," Deckmore reported after another failed detection attempt. "The pattern suggests either advanced technological countermeasures or an intimate understanding of our surveillance capabilities that borders on the supernatural." "Could it be another monitoring team?" Veltar wondered aloud, though the possibility filled him with a sort of dread usually reserved for audit notifications and mandatory sensitivity training sessions. Perhaps another species has established unauthorized surveillance operations? The thought that they might be conducting surveillance of humans who were being watched by an unknown entity that was potentially monitoring their monitoring operations created the sort of recursive paranoia loop that required specialized therapy to resolve. The hegemon's mental health services had developed entire treatment protocols for surveillance psychological disorders, though they generally involved large quantities of sedatives and strongly worded recommendations to consider career changes. Tobias Vex possessed the sort of practical competence that came from spending years convincing hostile environments to become slightly less hostile through a combination of engineering expertise and creative profanity. As the de facto leader of the human settlement on Kepler 442c, he had developed a management philosophy based on the principle that most problems could be solved by either fixing them properly or hitting them with something heavy enough to make them reconsider their life choices. The morning routine at Settlement Gamma, a name chosen because Settlement Charlie had been destroyed by unexpected geological activity and Settlement Delta was still smoldering, began with Tobias's careful inventory of their remaining supplies. The resupply schedule from Earth operated according to the sort of optimistic timeline that assumed space travel would eventually become as reliable as municipal bus service, which meant their deliveries typically arrived somewhere between eventually and probably never. Food stores at 67%, Tobias muttered to himself, running calculations that involved balancing nutritional requirements against the colony's unfortunate tendency to encounter situations that required sudden evacuations. Water reclamation operating at normal efficiency, assuming our definition of normal includes occasional mechanical screaming. The water reclamation system had been designed by engineers who had apparently never encountered water that actively resented being reclaimed. The local groundwater possessed a chemical composition that qualified as both corrosive and personally insulting, requiring constant adjustments to keep their purification equipment from filing formal complaints with the manufacturer. Maintenance engineer Petra Holt emerged from the mechanical systems bay, wearing the expression of someone who had spent the morning negotiating with technology that operated according to its own mysterious agenda. Her specialty was convincing broken equipment to continue functioning through a combination of technical expertise and therapeutic conversation, a skill set that had proven surprisingly valuable in frontier colony management. The atmospheric processors are having another philosophical crisis, Petra announced, wiping grease from her hands with a cloth that had given up any pretense of cleanliness several maintenance cycles ago. They've decided that oxygen production is beneath their dignity and are threatening to switch to producing noble gases instead. Can you convince them otherwise? Tobias asked, though he had learned that equipment psychology was not an exact science, and sometimes required creative approaches to conflict resolution. I've tried reasoning with them, but they're being stubborn. I may need to resort to percussive maintenance therapy. Petra hefted a wrench with the practiced ease of someone who had learned that sometimes the most sophisticated response to technological problems was hitting them with something heavy until they remembered their purpose in life. The settlement's agricultural division had achieved success through the simple expedient of treating their crops like particularly demanding roommates who required constant attention and occasional stern conversations about productivity expectations. Dr. Marcus Chen had developed growing techniques that involved equal parts agricultural science and motivational speaking, addressing their plants with the sort of encouraging enthusiasm typically reserved for nervous public speakers. The protein crops are exceeding expectations, Marcus reported during their weekly status meeting, consulting notes that seemed to contain more psychological profiles than botanical data. I've been having daily conversations with them about the importance of their role in colony nutrition, and they appear to be responding positively to the personal attention. The colony's success had been built on the sort of pragmatic innovation that emerged when necessity combined with creative problem-solving and a healthy disregard for conventional approaches. Their shelter systems had been constructed using local materials that technically violated several engineering standards but possessed the advantage of actually working in their specific environment. "The perimeter sensors are registering some unusual activity," reported security specialist Elena Vasquez, whose background in corporate security had required significant adaptation to handle threats that couldn't be resolved through strongly worded legal documents. "Nothing definitively hostile, but we're getting movement signatures at the edge of our detection range." "Local wildlife?" Tobias asked, though the planet's fauna had proven to be surprisingly considerate about avoiding human settlements, possibly because they found human behavior as confusing as humans found theirs. "That's what I initially assumed, but the patterns are wrong. Whatever it is seems to be conducting systematic reconnaissance of our perimeter, but it's avoiding our surveillance cameras with what appears to be deliberate intent." The possibility that they were being watched by something intelligent enough to avoid detection while maintaining surveillance had occurred to Tobias, though he had filed it under the category of problems that would require attention if they became more pressing than the 17 other immediate threats to colony survival that required his daily attention. "Could be another survey team," he mused, though unauthorized human presence on Kepler 4 and 42c would have required bureaucratic oversights of galactic proportions. "Or maybe we've got indigenous intelligence that's curious about our construction techniques." The thought that they might be sharing their planet with intelligent natives who were politely observing their settlement activities from a respectful distance was actually somewhat comforting. It suggested that their presence wasn't considered immediately threatening, which was more courtesy than they had received from most of the local ecosystem. Nixara had volunteered for close-range reconnaissance with a sort of enthusiastic terror that characterized her species' approach to dangerous situations. The assignment required establishing a concealed observation post within visual range of the human settlement, which meant spending extended periods motionless while maintaining constant awareness of potential threats, ranging from hostile wildlife to interdimensional apex predators. The concealment technology provided by hegemony equipment manufacturers promised complete invisibility across 17 different spectrums, though the fine print contained disclaimers about performance in environments with unusual electromagnetic conditions or non-standard reality parameters. Kepler 442c qualified as both, which meant the equipment worked perfectly until it didn't, at which point it typically failed in creative and memorable ways. "Observation post established," Nixara reported through her concealed communications array, which transmitted on frequencies specifically chosen to avoid interference from the planet's electromagnetic storms. "Maintaining visual surveillance of the human settlement's primary activity areas." The humans, she noted, approached their daily routines with the sort of methodical competence that suggested they had successfully adapted to their environment, despite operating with technology that appeared to be held together through a combination of engineering and wishful thinking. Their efficiency was both impressive and mildly disturbing, particularly considering that they seemed to accomplish more with inferior resources than most hegemony colonies managed with comprehensive technological support. "Detecting movement in Sector 7 Alpha," Nixara whispered, her communication protocols automatically shifting to emergency frequencies. "Large entity approaching from the forest perimeter, utilizing natural cover with apparent expertise." The entity moved through the terrain with the sort of fluid grace that suggested either extensive training and stealth techniques or natural evolution toward perfect predatory efficiency. It maintained position at the edge of visual range, utilizing shadows and vegetation cover in patterns that indicated deliberate tactical awareness rather than instinctive hiding behavior. "Can you get a positive identification?" Veltar's voice carried the sort of professional calm that suggested he was already preparing incident reports for whatever was about to happen. "Negative on identification. Entity appears to be utilizing active camouflage, or possibly natural adaptation that interferes with sensor readings. Estimated size suggests something significantly larger than local wildlife norms." The creature, if it was a creature rather than advanced technology disguised as biological life, maintained its surveillance position for approximately 37 minutes before beginning what appeared to be a systematic patrol of the settlement's perimeter. Its movement patterns suggested familiarity with both the terrain and the human activity schedules, indicating either extensive prior observation or an intelligence capacity that bordered on the unnerving. "It's carrying something," Nixara reported, adjusting her visual enhancers to maximum magnification. "Multiple objects of varying sizes, possibly organic in nature. The behavioral pattern suggests transportation rather than hunting." The revelation that their mysterious apex predator was apparently engaged in delivery services created the sort of cognitive dissonance that hegemony training programs had never adequately prepared her for. The creature moved with obvious predatory capability while engaged in what appeared to be humanitarian assistance, which violated several fundamental assumptions about predator-prey relationships. "Wait," Nixara transmitted, her voice carrying the sort of stunned realization that typically preceded either major scientific breakthroughs or career-ending disasters. "It's approaching the human settlement, but maintaining stealth protocols. I think it's delivering something to their supply storage area." The entity approached the human settlement with the sort of careful precision that suggested intimate familiarity with their security arrangements and activity patterns. It deposited its cargo near their supply storage facility with the sort of practiced efficiency that indicated this was not its first delivery mission, then withdrew, using routes that avoided their surveillance equipment with supernatural accuracy. "The humans appear to be completely unaware of the delivery," Nixara continued, watching as Tobias Vex emerged from the settlement's main building and discovered the deposited items. "They're examining the materials with obvious surprise but no apparent alarm. Their behavior suggests this has happened before." Tobias's reaction to finding mysterious supplies deposited near their storage area displayed the sort of practical acceptance that characterized human responses to unexplained but beneficial phenomena. He examined the delivered items with obvious curiosity, conducted a quick safety assessment, then began incorporating them into their supply inventory with the sort of efficient pragmatism that suggested he had categorized mysterious helpful deliveries as a positive environmental feature rather than a cause for concern. "The entity has withdrawn to a concealed observation position approximately 200 meters from the settlement perimeter," Nixara reported, tracking movement signatures that appeared and disappeared according to what seemed like deliberate timing patterns. "It appears to be monitoring the human response to its delivery." The concept of a stealth-capable apex predator that conducted supply deliveries while maintaining surveillance of the recipients created the sort of logical paradox that would require completely new categories in the hegemony's threat assessment databases. Their classification systems had been designed to handle entities that were either helpful or dangerous, not beings that appeared to be both simultaneously, according to criteria that made sense only to themselves. "Continue monitoring," Veltar instructed, though his tone suggested he was already composing the sort of report that would require extensive footnotes explaining why reality had decided to behave unreasonably. "And try to determine if this is regular behavior or an isolated incident." The entity maintained its concealed observation position until the humans had completed their examination of the delivered supplies, then withdrew into the forest, using routes that avoided every single piece of surveillance equipment with accuracy that could not possibly be coincidental. Its departure was so perfectly timed and executed that Nixara began to suspect it possessed either comprehensive intelligence about their monitoring capabilities or access to technology that made their surveillance efforts appear quaint by comparison. "Sir," Nixara transmitted after reviewing her sensor logs, "I think we're not the only ones conducting surveillance operations in this area." Tobias had developed a philosophical approach to mysterious beneficial phenomena that involved accepting good fortune while maintaining appropriate caution about its implications. The discovery of fresh fruit and protein supplies deposited near their storage facility represented either extraordinary luck or the kind of situation that would eventually require more complicated explanations than he was prepared to provide in his daily reports to Earth. "The nutritional analysis checks out," Dr. Chen announced, after completing his examination of the latest mysterious delivery. High-quality protein sources, fresh organic matter that appears to be cultivated rather than foraged, and preservation techniques that suggest advanced agricultural knowledge. The supplies had been packaged with the sort of careful attention to preservation and presentation that indicated whoever was providing them understood human nutritional requirements and possessed access to food production capabilities that exceeded their own colony's agricultural output. The implications were either encouraging or deeply concerning, depending on whether their anonymous benefactor was motivated by altruism or more complex agenda considerations. Could be another human colony, suggested Elena, though her security background made her naturally suspicious of beneficial coincidences that couldn't be easily explained through conventional means. Maybe there's been a bureaucratic oversight and we've got neighbors who are sharing resources. The possibility that they were not the only human presence on Kepler 442c would have represented a failure of colonial administration protocols so comprehensive that it bordered on the spectacular. The paperwork required to establish unauthorized human settlements would have required conspiracy-level coordination across multiple government agencies, which was theoretically possible but practically unlikely given bureaucracy's natural resistance to efficient coordination. The preservation techniques are too advanced, Marcus observed, examining packaging materials that appeared to be organic in nature but possessed characteristics that exceeded known biological capabilities. This isn't human technology, at least not anything in our current development database. Tobias had been conducting his own investigation of their mysterious supply situation, which involved the sort of patient observation techniques he had learned during his previous career in corporate troubleshooting. The key to solving unexplained problems was usually identifying patterns that revealed underlying logical structures, even when those structures operated according to unfamiliar principles. "I've been tracking the delivery schedule," he announced during their evening briefing, consulting notes that combined logistics analysis with behavioral psychology. The supplies appear every 3 days, always during the 4-hour window when our external monitoring systems are cycling through maintenance protocols. The timing is too consistent to be coincidental. "So our benefactor knows our operational schedule," Elena concluded, her security instincts immediately shifting to threat assessment mode. "That suggests either comprehensive surveillance capabilities or access to our internal operational documentation. The revelation that their supply deliverer possessed detailed knowledge of their settlement's operational patterns created the sort of security implications that required careful consideration. Either they were being observed by entities with surveillance capabilities that exceeded their detection systems, or they had somehow earned the assistance of beings who understood their needs through less technologically intensive means. "There's another possibility," Tobias said, reviewing the patterns he had identified through weeks of careful observation. "What if our supplier isn't trying to hide from us, but from someone else who might be watching? The concept that their mysterious benefactor might be conducting covert operations to avoid detection by third parties, rather than the humans themselves, offered a different perspective on the situation. It suggested that they might be caught in the middle of a more complex situation involving multiple parties with different agenda priorities and surveillance capabilities. "I'm going to try direct contact," Tobias announced, causing the sort of concerned expressions that typically preceded discussions about life insurance policies and emergency succession protocols. "If someone's been helping us survive on this planet, the least we can do is acknowledge their assistance properly." The decision to attempt communication with their anonymous supplier represented either courageous leadership or spectacularly poor judgment, depending on whether their benefactor turned out to be motivated by altruism or more complicated considerations. Tobias had made the calculation that their current survival status was already dependent on this entity's continued goodwill, which meant direct communication represented an acceptable risk compared to maintaining ignorance about their situation. "I'll leave a message at the next delivery site," he continued, outlining a plan that combined diplomatic protocol with practical risk management. basic gratitude expression, introduction to our settlement leadership, and an invitation for direct communication if they're interested in establishing formal contact. The message preparation required careful consideration of cultural sensitivity issues when the culture in question was completely unknown and potentially operated according to principles that had no correlation with human social conventions. Tobias settled on a combination of universal gratitude expressions, practical information about their settlement status, and an open invitation for whatever form of communication their benefactor preferred. The message will be positioned at the delivery site with appropriate visibility markers, Tobias explained, reviewing his communication strategy with the sort of methodical thoroughness he applied to all potentially civilization-altering decisions. If they respond positively, we'll proceed with formal contact protocols. If they withdraw, we'll respect their preference for anonymity and continue accepting their assistance with appropriate gratitude. The evening of his planned message delivery, Tobias established himself in a concealed observation position that provided visual coverage of the delivery site while maintaining enough distance to avoid appearing threatening. The waiting required the sort of patient stillness that he had learned during his corporate career, though surveillance of mysterious alien benefactors presented unique psychological challenges compared to monitoring quarterly productivity reports. Movement at the forest edge appeared exactly on schedule, confirming that their supplier operated according to precise timing protocols that suggested either advanced planning capabilities or access to automated scheduling systems. The entity approached the delivery site with obvious caution, apparently detecting the presence of Tobias's message before conducting its usual supply deposit. "Well," said a voice from approximately 3 meters behind Tobias's concealed position, speaking in slightly accented but perfectly comprehensible English. "I suppose it was inevitable that someone would eventually notice the fruit deliveries." The emergency session of the Hegemony's Xenobiological Threat Assessment Committee convened with the sort of panicked efficiency that typically accompanied the discovery that their fundamental assumptions about reality had been operating under severe misconceptions. Velta found himself presenting surveillance reports that read like collaborative fiction written by a xenobiologist and a particularly creative comedian, while committee members struggled to process information that violated several basic principles of their classification systems. "Let me ensure I understand the situation correctly," announced committee chair being Zektar, whose species possessed the unfortunate combination of bureaucratic authority and a tendency to require detailed explanations for anything that deviated from established protocols. "Our apex predator entity has been revealed to be a member of the Zephyran species, which our records indicate was extinct as of approximately 400 standard cycles ago." "That appears to be correct," Veltar confirmed, reviewing reports that contained more plot twists than most entertainment productions. "The individual identifies himself as Kronos, a survivor of a transport vessel that crashed on Kepler 442c during a routine evacuation mission that was apparently never properly documented by our refugee assistance programs. The revelation that their mysterious monster was actually a displaced refugee whose survival had been enabled by bureaucratic incompetence created the sort of administrative crisis that required specialized committees to determine which other committees should be held responsible for the oversight. The Zephyrian species had been classified as extinct based on reports that had apparently failed to account for individuals who had been outside their home system during the catastrophic event that had destroyed their civilization. According to his testimony, Veltar continued, consulting notes that documented a conversation between humans and a supposedly extinct alien that had occurred while 17 different species conducted surveillance operations. "Kronos has been living on Kepler 442c for approximately 63 standard cycles, surviving through a combination of advanced camouflage capabilities and careful resource management, and he's been assisting the human settlement," Chicthu senior scientist Dekval interjected, her excitement about the xenobiological implications clearly overriding her concern about the bureaucratic ramifications. This represents an unprecedented example of interspecies cooperation achieved through informal contact protocols. The concept that successful first contact had been achieved through accidental cohabitation, while multiple official monitoring operations conducted surveillance without recognizing what was happening, created the sort of ironic situation that would require new categories in their diplomatic achievement databases. The humans and their Zephyrian neighbor had established peaceful coexistence through practical cooperation, while the hegemony's official protocols had classified the situation as a potential threat, requiring comprehensive threat assessment. The humans appear to have accepted his presence with remarkable adaptability, Beltar reported, reviewing surveillance footage that documented the establishment of formal communication between Settlement Gamma and their previously anonymous supplier. Their leader, Tobias Vex, has initiated resource-sharing negotiations and established basic diplomatic protocols for ongoing cooperation, without any input from official first contact specialists, Zektar asked, her tone suggesting the sort of professional concern that typically preceded recommendations for mandatory retraining programs. Apparently, they handled the situation through practical problem-solving rather than bureaucratic consultation, Veltar confirmed. The initial contact proceeded smoothly, with both parties expressing satisfaction about formalizing their previously informal cooperation arrangement. The success of unauthorized first contact achieved through common sense and mutual assistance represented either a vindication of practical diplomacy or a devastating critique of official protocols, depending on which committee was responsible for evaluating the implications. The humans had managed to establish peaceful relations with a supposedly extinct species, while multiple official monitoring operations failed to recognize that they were observing a refugee assistance program rather than a threat situation. What are the implications for our threat assessment protocols? Demanded committee member Rixma, whose species specialized in finding security vulnerabilities in even the most benign situations. If our surveillance operations fail to identify a Zephyrian survivor conducting resource-sharing activities, what other classification errors might exist in our databases? The possibility that their threat assessment systems contained other catastrophic misidentifications created the sort of systematic review requirements that would occupy entire departments for multiple cycles. The bureaucratic implications of acknowledging that they had misclassified a humanitarian situation as a potential security threat would require extensive revisions to their monitoring protocols, and possibly their fundamental approach to xenobiological assessment. I recommend immediate reclassification of both human and Zephyrian threat levels, Beltar suggested, proposing solutions that would minimize the administrative catastrophe while acknowledging the reality of the situation. The humans have demonstrated successful adaptation and peaceful capabilities, while Kronos represents a refugee situation rather than a security threat. And our monitoring operations? Zerktar asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer would require significant budget allocations for sensitivity training and protocol revisions. I suggest we transition from covert surveillance to official diplomatic contact, Veltar proposed, outlining a strategy that would transform their bureaucratic oversight into legitimate governmental relations. Both parties have expressed interest in formal recognition and resource-sharing agreements, which represents an opportunity to establish productive interspecies cooperation. The committee spent the remainder of their session debating the appropriate paperwork required to reclassify a threat situation as a diplomatic success, which involved consulting regulations that had been written by beings who had never anticipated the need to explain how surveillance subjects had accidentally achieved their own first contact while being monitored for threat assessment purposes. The final irony, Veltar observed during his closing remarks, is that our most successful first contact operation was achieved by beings who were completely unaware they were participating in first contact, while our official monitoring efforts were focused on preventing the very cooperation that actually occurred. The meeting concluded with the establishment of 17 new subcommittees, tasked with determining how to transform their magnificent surveillance failure into a diplomatic success story, which would require administrative creativity that bordered on the artistic. The establishment of formal diplomatic relations between Settlement Gamma and the hegemony of sentient species proceeded with the sort of careful protocol management that occurred when bureaucrats attempted to transform an embarrassing oversight into a planned diplomatic achievement. Tobias found himself appointed as Earth's unofficial ambassador to the galaxy, a position that came with impressive-sounding credentials and absolutely no training in interstellar diplomatic procedures. The hegemony representative seemed genuinely surprised that we're not terrified of them, Tobias observed during his morning briefing with Kronos, whose fluency in 17 different languages had made him an invaluable diplomatic translator. Apparently they expected us to be impressed by their technological superiority rather than interested in trade negotiations. Kronos, whose Zephyrian heritage included natural camouflage abilities and an unfortunate tendency toward existential philosophy, had adapted to his role as cultural liaison with the sort of bemused competence that came from 63 cycles of observing various species make fundamental assumptions about reality that were only occasionally accurate. Most species experience significant anxiety when confronted with evidence of galactic civilization, Kronos explained, adjusting his appearance to a less intimidating configuration that wouldn't trigger the panic responses of visiting hegemony officials. Humans appear to treat it as a business opportunity rather than an existential crisis. The practical approach that Settlement Gamma had taken toward galactic contact reflected their general philosophy that unknown situations were simply familiar problems disguised as something more complicated. Tobias had organized their diplomatic preparations using the same resource management techniques he applied to colony administration, treating first contact protocols as an elaborate form of corporate negotiation with unusually diverse participants. The trade agreements are actually fairly straightforward, Tobias continued, reviewing documentation that combined interstellar commerce regulations with frontier colony supply requirements. They need agricultural products that can be grown in our specific environmental conditions, and we need manufactured goods that our fabrication systems can't produce with local resources. The discovery that humans possessed agricultural capabilities that were valuable to galactic markets had surprised hegemony trade representatives, who had classified human civilization as too primitive to produce anything of commercial interest. The revelation that their supposedly backwards colony was already producing food surpluses that exceeded the output of established agricultural worlds had required significant revisions to their economic assessment databases. Dr. Chen's psychological agriculture techniques appear to be completely unprecedented in galactic farming methodology, Kronos noted with obvious amusement. The hegemony's agricultural specialists are requesting detailed documentation of his crop motivation procedures. The formalization of diplomatic relations had also revealed that Settlement Gamma's survival achievements represented a significant underestimation of human adaptive capabilities. Their successful establishment of a thriving colony on a planet that other species had classified as uninhabitable had attracted attention from xenobiological researchers who were interested in studying their environmental adaptation techniques. The hegemony wants to establish a cultural exchange program, Tobias announced, reviewing proposals that would bring alien students to study human problem-solving methods while sending colony representatives to observe galactic civilization. Apparently, our approach to technological improvisation is considered an advanced form of engineering philosophy. Petra's maintenance techniques had generated particular interest among hegemony engineers, whose species had developed sophisticated technological systems but had never considered the therapeutic value of percussive maintenance therapy. Her methods for convincing malfunctioning equipment to resume proper operation through a combination of technical expertise and motivational conversation had been classified as an innovative approach to human-machine interface psychology. Elena's security protocols are also receiving attention, Cronus added, translating communications from hegemony defense specialists who were studying human approaches to threat assessment. Her ability to maintain colony safety while operating with limited resources has been identified as an example of efficient security management under adverse conditions. The gradual integration of Settlement Gamma into galactic civilization proceeded with the sort of methodical efficiency that characterized human approaches to complex social situations. Rather than being overwhelmed by the implications of interstellar society, the colonists had approached it as an expansion of their existing community that happened to include beings from different star systems. The most interesting development, Tobias observed, reviewing reports from newly established communication channels with various hegemony member species, is that our survival techniques are being studied by colonies throughout the galaxy. Apparently, we've accidentally become a case study in successful frontier settlement. The irony that a human colony established on a supposedly uninhabitable planet had become a model for galactic settlement techniques represented the sort of achievement that occurred when practical competence combined with creative problem-solving and a healthy disregard for expert opinions about impossibility. Settlement Gamma had succeeded through the simple expedient of treating challenges as problems to be solved rather than limitations to be accepted. The betting pools have had to be restructured, Cronus mentioned, with the sort of casual amusement that suggested he had been following the gambling operations with professional interest. The odds have shifted from survival probability to predictions about which galactic agricultural records the colony will break next. The transformation of Settlement Gamma from a struggling frontier outpost to a diplomatic center representing Earth's interests in galactic civilization had occurred with the sort of gradual inevitability that characterized many human achievements. Their success had been built on the principle that unknown situations were simply familiar challenges requiring creative solutions and appropriate resource management. Social media recently, a term put on most worlds, managing the real question, Tobias concluded, reviewing their first quarterly report as Earth's galactic representatives, is whether the rest of human civilization is ready to discover that the galaxy is full of species who are just as confused about how to handle daily life as we are, but with better technology and more complicated paperwork. The final irony of their situation was that the hegemony's monster had turned out to be a refugee who needed assistance, while the primitive humans they had been monitoring for threat assessment had accidentally become their newest diplomatic success story. The galaxy, it seemed, operated according to principles that were simultaneously more complex and more straightforward than anyone had properly anticipated. As Tobias prepared for another day of managing interstellar trade negotiations while ensuring their atmospheric processes continued producing breathable air, he reflected that the universe's tendency to provide unexpected solutions to difficult problems was either evidence of cosmic benevolence or proof that reality possessed a sophisticated sense of humor. Either way, Settlement Gamma had learned to accept beneficial surprises with appropriate gratitude and careful preparation for whatever delightfully complicated situations the future might provide. The monster in the shadows had turned out to be a neighbor bringing fruit, and the dangerous humans had proven to be competent farmers with diplomatic potential. In a galaxy full of bureaucrats who specialized in making simple things complicated, perhaps that represented the most alien achievement of all, practical common sense that actually worked.